The air was thick with suspense that morning, the kind of silence that makes you feel something big is about to happen. I had been dating Grace for several months now, and everything seemed almost too good to be true. She was intelligent, compassionate, and full of warmth, the kind of person who could light up a room with just her presence. I'd grown so fond of her that I started picturing her in my future. I imagined Grace standing by my side on our wedding day, the one I'd build a life and family with. It felt perfect until that day. Grace had been living with me for a while, and the time had come for her to meet my mother. Mom had been asking about her for weeks, eager to meet the woman who had captured my heart. I had always brushed it off with, "Soon, Mom, you'll meet her soon." But soon had turned into today. My mother was coming over for the first time in months. I spent the entire morning preparing every corner of the house and making sure everything was perfect. Most importantly, I told Grace to be ready. "She's going to love you," I said, trying to reassure her as we got things in order. Grace gave me her usual warm smile, the kind that melted all my worries away. "I hope so," she said softly. "I really want to make a good impression." "You will," I replied confidently. "You're incredible. She'll adore you." When the doorbell rang, my pulse quickened. I looked over at Grace, who nodded and headed to the bedroom to give me a moment with Mom. "Mom," I greeted, opening the door. She stood there, radiant and beaming. We hugged tightly, her familiar scent bringing a wave of nostalgia. She punched me in the ribs. "Oh, it's so good to see you," she exclaimed, pulling back to examine me. "You look happy. Really happy." "Well, I am, Mom," I said, ushering her inside. "Come in. Sit down." As she stepped into the house, she surveyed the space with approval. "You've done well keeping this place in order." "Well, I've had help," I admitted with a small grin. We moved to the living room where I guided her to the couch. "Would you like some tea?" "Tea sounds perfect," she said, settling in comfortably. As I prepared the tea in the kitchen, my thoughts drifted to Grace. I couldn't wait for my mother to meet her and understand why she meant so much to me. This meeting was supposed to be the final piece of the puzzle in our perfect relationship. I returned with the tea, setting it carefully on the table. "Mom, there's someone I'd like you to meet." Her eyes lit up with curiosity. "Finally, Grace, right?" "Yes, Grace," I replied with a smile. "She's been staying with me for a while, and I think it's time you two met." My mother nodded, her hands warming around the teacup. "I've been looking forward to this. I'm excited to meet the woman who's made my son so happy." I stood up, my nerves tingling with excitement. "I'll go get her." Walking to the bedroom, I felt an odd mixture of excitement and unease. Though the unease was small, fleeting, and easy to ignore. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. I entered the bedroom, resting my elbows on the wooden workbench, and very carefully turned my head to face Rory. I stepped onto the wooden bench and looked down with my eyes. "Grace," I called gently as I opened the door. "It's time." She looked up from where she sat, her expression soft but amused. "Are you sure she's ready for me?" she teased. "She's been ready for ages," I said with a laugh. "Come on." We walked to the living room hand in hand. My mother was seated on the couch, mid-sip of her tea, her expression one of pleasant anticipation. "Mom," I said, gesturing to Grace. "This is Grace." As soon as Grace stepped into the room, my mother's entire demeanor changed. Her smile froze, and her eyes grew wide with terror. The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor. "Mom," I asked, panic rising in my chest. "What's wrong?" But she didn't respond. Her gaze was locked on Grace, her hands trembling violently. She rose abruptly, pointing a shaking finger at her. "A witch!" she screamed, her voice breaking with fear. "A serpent! An old witch serpent!" I stood there, utterly frozen, as the shock of my mother's words rang in my ears. She had just called Grace a woman I loved deeply, an old witch snake. The accusation felt absurd, impossible, and yet the fear in my mother's voice was unmistakable. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I turned to Grace, expecting her to share my confusion, but what I saw shook me to my core. Grace's face wasn't just shocked, it was pale with fear. Her wide eyes darted nervously, and her lips trembled as she whispered, "Mama, you can see me?" I blinked, the words barely registering. "What?" I asked, my voice shaky, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. Grace turned toward me, her hands trembling. "But how?" she stammered, ignoring my question as her gaze remained fixed on my mother, who was now trembling at the doorway. "This shouldn't be happening." Helen smiled as she waited for me to react and yielded permission for me to finish. "What do you mean?" I demanded, stepping closer to her. "Grace, what's going on? Why did you ask if she could see you? What aren't you telling me?" Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped back, her face a mask of dread. Suddenly, my mother broke the tense silence. Her voice rose again, panicked and trembling. "Witch, snake, I knew it. I knew there was something unnatural about her. Witches," she cried. She was suddenly becoming more verbal, confused, and began to wail. Grace flinched, her body going rigid. Slowly, she turned to look at me, and then I saw something that made my breath catch. Her eyes, those warm, familiar eyes, were changing. The soft brown I adored was fading, replaced by a glowing, sickly yellow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. In a misbreeding sunlight, she made the lines of her face. "Grace," I whispered, terror creeping into my voice. "What's happening to you?" She opened her mouth as if to explain, but no words came out. Before she could respond, my mother grabbed my arm with an iron grip, her urgency breaking through my paralysis. "We need to leave, now," she hissed, pulling me toward the door with surprising strength. "She's dangerous. We're not safe." I resisted, torn between disbelief and terror. "Mom, wait! What are you saying, Grace?" I turned back to her, desperate for answers. But Grace was no longer the woman I thought I knew. Her body trembled violently, her fists clenched, as a guttural, bone-chilling laugh escaped her lips. "You can't leave," she said, her voice deeper, darker, and nothing like the Grace I knew. "Not now. Not after you've seen the truth." Her laughter grew louder, echoing around the room as her body began to contort unnaturally. Her limbs stretched grotesquely, her skin rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. "Grace!" I shouted, my voice trembling, but it was too late. In a matter of seconds, the woman I loved was gone. Standing before us was a massive python, its gleaming scales shimmering ominously. Its yellow eyes glowed with malice, and its forked tongue, impossibly long, flicked menacingly through the air. The room filled with a suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of the python hissing, a sound that sent chills down my spine. 3 seconds passed. "Run!" my mother screamed, pulling me with all her strength toward the door as the creature coiled, preparing to strike. Grace, now in the form of a massive python, began slithering toward us, her eyes locked onto me with a predatory intensity. My mother was still gripping my arm, her entire body trembling with fear and anger. "Get back!" my mother screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing at Grace as if her words alone could push her away. "You foul creature! Get away from my son!" But Grace, or whatever this monster had become, didn't stop. She only hissed louder, her massive coiled body advancing with terrifying grace. The glint in her eyes told me that she had no intention of letting us leave. I could feel my own body shaking uncontrollably. This couldn't be happening. How had my world spiraled into this nightmare? The woman I loved had turned into a snake, a predator, and was now coming for me. "Mom, we need to run," I shouted, pulling at her hand, trying to get us out of there. But just as I tugged on her, something strange happened. My mother's hand, still tightly wrapped around mine, began to heat up. At first, it was just a slight warmth, but then it intensified, becoming unbearably hot. I gasped and pulled my hand back, startled by the searing heat. "Mom?" I asked, my voice trembling. She turned toward me, but something was changing. Her skin seemed to ripple, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. No, this can't be," she muttered to herself, shaking her head as if trying to stop what was happening. I stared, horrified, as my mother's body began to shift and twist, her limbs elongating, her skin hardening and taking on the same scaly texture I had just seen in Grace. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I could barely breathe. This had to be a dream. None of this could be real. Before I could even fully process what was happening, my mother had transformed into something I never thought possible: a python. But unlike Grace, my mother's snake form was even larger, her body twisting and coiling as she stood opposite Grace, her eyes filled with rage. I stood frozen, watching as the two monstrous serpents faced each other. Grace let out a low, menacing hiss, while my mother, now in the form of this massive python, raised her head high, preparing for a fight. The room felt suffocating, as if the very air had been sucked out. I was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Without warning, the two snakes lunged at each other, their massive bodies colliding with a sickening thud. They began biting and snapping at one another, their jaws locking onto each other's flesh. Blood began to splatter across the room as their teeth sank into scales, ripping and tearing at each other's bodies. Their massive forms twisted and coiled, knocking over furniture as they fought. "Stop!" I screamed, but they didn't listen. They were too consumed by their primal battle, locked in a deadly struggle for dominance. I couldn't take it anymore. My heart raced. My mind felt like it was going to explode. I needed to get out of there. I couldn't stay and watch this nightmare unfold any longer. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned and ran out of the room, my feet stumbling as I bolted for the door. The sound of hissing and the crash of their bodies echoed behind me, but I couldn't look back. I needed to escape. I needed to get help. I ran down the street, my mind reeling, unsure of where to go or who to turn to. My feet carried me instinctively toward the nearest place I could think of, a church that wasn't far from my house. The church had always been a place of peace and refuge, but now it was my last hope. When I reached the church, I burst through the doors, gasping for air, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear myself speak. The pastor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, turned to me, alarmed. "Son, what happened?" he asked, walking toward me with concern etched across his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I don't know how to explain it," I stammered, still struggling to catch my breath. "My girlfriend, Grace, she turned into a snake. And then my mother, she turned into one too. They're fighting. I don't know what's happening. Please, you have to help me." The pastor's eyes widened in shock, but he didn't dismiss me. He placed a firm hand on my shoulder, guiding me to sit down on one of the pews. "Calm down, son. Take a deep breath. Are you sure of what you saw?" I nodded frantically. "Yes, I know how it sounds, but you have to believe me. They're going to kill each other if we don't do something." The pastor's face grew serious. He stood up and grabbed his Bible, holding it tightly. "Take me to your home," he said. "If what you say is true, we must act quickly." We rushed back to the house together, my heart racing even faster than before. The pastor muttered prayers under his breath as we approached my front door, and I could feel a strange tension in the air, a heaviness that made me feel like I was walking into something evil. When we stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The violent sounds of the snake fight were gone, replaced by stillness. My heart sank as my eyes scanned the room. Connor deflected some of the crooks. There was no sign of my mother or Grace. No giant pythons, no creatures writhing in battle. But what I did see made my blood run cold. A large pool of blood in the middle of the room, deep red and glistening in the dim light. Blood was smeared across the floor and walls, and the smell of iron hung heavy in the air. The pastor crossed himself, his face pale. "God have mercy," he whispered. Trenbel. I stood frozen, staring at the blood, my mind spinning. "Where are they?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What happened to them?" The pastor shook his head, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for answers. "I don't know, son," he said quietly, "but whatever took place here, it's beyond the realm of man." For weeks after that night, I tried to come to terms with what had happened. The church conducted deliverance on me, cleansing my home, trying to rid it off whatever evil had taken root there. But nothing felt the same after that. My mother was gone, Grace was gone, and I was left with nothing but questions and nightmares. Since that night, my life has never been the same. I have been hunted by the memory of that horrific battle, by the blood, by the way everything I thought I knew was torn apart in an instant.